The Javelin, a device nearly as old as time itself. While its roots derive from the Paleolithic era, humans eventually found a way to apply it to something we recognize nowadays, a sport. Whether it's the intense buildup of the audience clapping, the steezy run-up of the athlete, or the beautiful release of a javelin that flies for meters upon meters, it is an absolute gem to watch this event unfold in real time. The event's history also goes far beyond just how far a human can throw the spear though, as the javelin was subjected to a plethora of exploits and renovations that very few sports can contest that notion alone. Let's take a look at the world record progression of the javelin. The first notable documentations of the javelin record primarily took place in Finland and Sweden in the late 1800s in terms of its first competitive endeavors. It was also mainly done as a part of a bigger competition where athletes partook in a multitude of events like a pentathlon. With the javelin in particular though, they would throw with each hand, add the totals, and your combined effort was your mark. The first record was set by a Finnish athlete named Marit Mekshmontan, who threw 103 foot, or 30.58 meters converted. This record, among a couple others, allegedly used different weighted javelins, some lighter, some heavier, but by 1891, this was no longer an issue as they would use the standard 800-gram javelin, or at the very least something pretty close. In this year, 3 further records were set as well, as Hjalmar Fellman and Emil Näsling from Finland bumped up the record another meter with marks of 37.61, 37.82, and 38.75. Then by 1892, Axel Lindblad from Sweden became the first man to throw over 40 meters with a mark of 40.38. To iron out the rest of the 19th century, the Finns and Swedes continually upped the record with the unique athlete taking the record each time. That was until the man who was closest to the 50-meter barrier took charge, and that was no other than Erik Lemming. While Hannes Kavisto captured the first 50-meter mark to start off the new century, Lemming would go on to become one of the most important throwers in Swedish history. Throughout the next 10 years, no one got in the way of Lemming's reign of javelin superiority. He threw 51.95 in 1902, 52.27, and 53.79 next year, and while it looked like he had reached his peak with a few more subtle adjustments to his record, he would annihilate his previous mark with a 57.33 throw on June 7th, 1908. In 1909, Hungarian athlete Mór Kocsan had stopped Lemming dead in his tracks with 3 throws well above the previous record, but the issue with this was that Kocsan utilized a very unconventional style of holding the javelin, where he'd grip the end of it to throw it further, aka freestyle. While this may have been considered a record at the time, modern record lists will denote Lemming's marks between 1909 and 1911 as the proper records. Even though this record at the time might have counted, it wouldn't last very long, because the first athlete to break 60 meters with proper technique would be Juho Saaristo from Finland, throwing 61.45 on June 25th, 1912. In about 3 decades, the record had doubled, and it was clear that there was a consistently vested interest in the event given how many times the record had been broken up until this point. Not long after Saaristo's record, a governing body would take athletics to a brand new level, and it would also allow the javelin to go through a grand series of changes in more ways than anyone could have seen coming. On September 29th, 1912, the first footage of a javelin world record would surface at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics. And what a better athlete than Erik Lemming to be the one to set his 13th or 10th official world record with a throw of 62.32 meters. If you're familiar with your typical javelin run-up, Lemming's may look pretty unorthodox in comparison. The acceleration is pretty minimal, and as he approaches his release, he veers off in the opposite direction of his throwing hand to use his back leg in a stutter step-esque approach to generate enough energy to throw the javelin. It wouldn't be too much longer until the coming decades though, where your traditional crossover steps were your primary technique before your release. This would be Lemming's last, yet fairly fitting record to end on, and it would be a couple years until Finland claimed back the record. But this time, for good. On May 17, 1914, Yone Miura set his first record of 63.29, but unfortunately this was not ratified, likely due to competing at an unsanctioned meet. As a matter of fact, his next 3 records weren't ratified, but in 1919, he eventually threw an official mark of 66.1 meters. This throw left the record out in the open for its longest period yet, as it went half a decade before the Swedes birthed yet another javelin prodigy, Gunnar Lindström. Breaking Miura's streak, Lindström happily walked away in his home country with a brand new record of 66.62 meters, but then unofficially beat it again by just shy of a meter. Miura surprisingly did steal it back a couple years later with a 68.55 throw, but a different Finn would inch ever so closely to the 70-meter barrier, which was Eino Pentila throwing 69.88. The man to break the 70-meter barrier, though, was someone who would set his one and only record, and that was Erik Lundqvist from Sweden, throwing 71.01 on August 15, 1928. These two countries could not seem to let one get ahead of each other. By now, it's basically been a half-century battle that didn't seem to have a sole winner yet, but with the rise of 2 more athletes, it was no question which country would get the last laugh in this seemingly perpetual battle for world records. Martti Arvinen from Finland showed up to the javelin scene similar to Miura in the sense that his first official record wasn't ratified, but thankfully this was only one instance in comparison. After setting the official record 3 times in just a 3-week span, Arvinen set his 4th record of the year on September 14th, 1930, throwing 72.93. Arvinen would continue to dominate the event in a way that hadn't been seen in a couple decades, as he approached his 10th official one on June 18th, 1936, throwing 77.23. But unfortunately for him, this streak was eventually broken for good by another Finn, Yrjö Nikkanen, who threw 77.87 in 1938 and then 78.70 2 months later. All of a sudden, though, the Finns were no longer capable of breaking another world record. As a matter of fact, no one was. Over the next 10 years, it was extremely rare to see anyone break the 75-meter zone. Plenty were in the low 70s, but this seemed to be a harsh sticking point that no one could seem to break through. It wouldn't be until 1951 where multiple men were breaking 75, and they looked to be promising contenders to throwing the first 80-meter throw. On July 25th, 1953, Cy Young from the US had been the closest to the record in the last 15 years, as he was just 58 centimeters from topping the new mark and becoming the first American to hold it as well. Young's American counterpart Bud Held came in swinging with the first ever throw over 80 meters with a mark of 80.41 meters on August 8th, 1953. This throw was more than just a landmark distance-wise though, because the javelin that was used for this was just a glimpse into the next big breakthrough in the event. Before the invention of the fittingly titled held javelin, virtually all records were done on what's called a karhu javelin, originated from Finland. However, Bud's brother, Dick Held, was a studying engineer in Stanford, and Bud had a revelation on how to make the javelin more aerodynamic, as he noticed the older iteration had issues once it reached past 200 feet, or 60 meters. Bud had the idea to make the javelin more hollow, so Dick got to work and messed around with aspects like the diameter, density, and was eventually able to craft a device that had nearly increased the surface area by 1/3 of the original finished version. The first professional athletes to try these were Bud, Cy Young, and Bill Miller, and the success was near immediate. During the 1954 season, Bill Miller had set his first world record of 81.29, albeit unofficially since the center of balance on his javelin was off by a few millimeters. Held had tied this record the next year, and within that same meet, threw the new official world record of 81.75 on May 21st, 1955. While the Americans were looking to be on the come up with their innovative technology, other countries either adjusted their own javelins or simply used the held version. Soni Nikkanen used a unique spear to break the record by almost 2 meters in 1956, and Janos Szydło from Poland beat it just 6 days later with a held javelin. The Held brothers single-handedly caused a noticeable shift in this event, but little did people know just a couple months later, someone quite literally broke the event.
En la ciudad deportiva de Anoeta, y a presencia de enviados especiales deportivos franceses, se efectúa una exhibición de la nueva modalidad del lanzamiento de la jabalina. logra 75,79. Las pruebas son fiscalizadas por jueces de la Federación Guipuzcoana de Atletismo. Erauzkin lanza también la jabalina y consigue 83,48 y extraoficialmente mejora su marca anterior.
Sometime in 1956, Felix Erauzkin, a previous multiple-time Spanish champion in multiple throwing events, had a mad scientist idea to apply the same logic a discus thrower would use towards a javelin. See this? Now imagine a javelin in that person's hands, and now add soap and/or water to lube up the hands for a proper throw. This was known as barra basca. This technique was so obscenely advantageous that the 48-year-old had broken the world record on his own accord, and new faces were destroying it as well by 10 to 20%, with some myths floating around where someone was throwing up to 120 meters. In the month of October, the javelin was flooded with throws over 85 meters, and it's been speculated that the Spanish team originally wanted to wait to use this technique to win the Olympic Games. As word caught on quickly though, and with records exploding every few days, the IAAF banned this technique almost immediately to catch it before the Olympics. After all, some articles report that professionals were landing only 10% of their throws within the sector, which poses a massive threat to events with many spectators and would generally make poor viewership for the event as well. Even though a massive wave of world records were now nullified, this didn't stop someone from not just breaking the world record legitimately, but doing so at the 1956 Olympic Games, where Egil Danielsen from Norway threw 85.71 for the country's first ever record on November 26, 1956. Following this record, American Al Cantello was looking super smooth on his throws as he launched an 85.29 throw in Compton, and just the very next throw, broke into the 86-meter zone on June 5th, 1959. Even though the held javelin obviously had an impact on pushing the event further, records did begin to halt in their tracks rather quickly, as it took 2 years for Carlo Lievere from Italy to break it in 1961, and Norway's Tarjei Pedersen eventually broke it by 38 centimeters on July 1st, 1964. Just 2 months later though, Pedersen took part in another meet in his country, and on his very first throw, he annihilated the record by the biggest margin ever seen. On September 2nd, 1964, Pedersen took over the previous record by 4.6 meters, launching the javelin 91.72 meters and setting what was looking to be the gold standard of javelin throwing. Pedersen even described his throw as fluent as it could possibly be, stating that his approach, release, just everything was perfect on that day. Despite this being the largest jump between records since the very first competitions, Janis Lucis from the Soviet Union was able to first try a world record throw in Finland 4 years later with a mark of 91.98 meters. To wrap up the 60s, the Finns came back with another monster thrower, Jorma Kinnunen, who secured a 92.70 meter throw. What was impressive about this year was that 3 men were now capable of throwing over 90 meters, but out of these 3, Lucius would yet again up the ante by 1 more meter on July 6, 1972, throwing 93.80 meters. The 70s in particular was the record's most dormant decade yet, but it still came with its few records. Klaus Waldfermann from West Germany had substantially improved upon his 1971 season, winning the 1972 Olympics by just 2 centimeters. But what was even more impressive was his 94.08 meter record just a couple months prior. At the 1976 Olympic Games, Miklós Németh from Hungary had come off of a 91.38 PR that year, along with Hannu Sintonen, who had thrown over 90 meters too. Not much footage exists, but thankfully, the footage from this throw was salvaged, and it just so happened to be the new world record.
Induló közül borzasztó erős berántás, repül a gerej, és már mikor félúton van, óriási a hang a stadionban, látják, azok is, akik nem értenek hozzá, azok is, akik igen, túlszáll minden elképzelhető. Most írták ki neki, tessék, most írták ki, de most az arcát nem lehet látni, hát minden most osztják el azt a képernyőt 4 felé, vagy legalább 2 felé.
The javelin throw was now just a little more than 5 meters away from reaching the legendary 100 meter mark. Even though someone was already close with the Spanish method a couple decades ago, the fact that it was doable through conventional methods was undeniably amazing to see within grasp. Ferenc Piragi from Hungary would get even closer, throwing 96.72, but Tom Petronov from the United States launched a monster throw, and the Javelin landed at the 99.72 meter mark on May 15th, 1983. There was no speculation now. Petronov was by far the most viable candidate to make Javelin history, but as the next year approached, a man from Germany would end up posing as a bigger threat far more than the American could have seen coming. In the early 80s, East Germany's Uwe Hohn had quickly been making a name for himself in the javelin scene, popping up in all-time lists in the 1980 and 1981 renditions, but had a breakout year at the European Championships where he threw 91.34. Strangely enough, he didn't put out any official marks in the 1983 season, where instead, Petronov and Detlef Michel were well on their way to dropping the first 100 bomb. 1984, on the other hand, it was as if Hohn was incapable of throwing below 90 meters. He threw 94.82 for his season opener, then immediately threw 99.52 just 2 weeks later for a massive PB. Naturally, word spread across like a wildfire given this type of progress was unheard of. But before many people could comprehend the sheer talent Hohn had, he would end up distorting the realities of everyone who knew anything about the javelin.
But even more astonishing, here's a record that may never be broken. Uwe Hohn of East Germany shatters American Tom Petronov's world record by over 16 feet. 343 feet, 10 inches. Watch where it lands, just inside the stadium. After this, the weight of the javelin will most assuredly be increased. The stadium are not big enough to hold the javelin anymore.
They're getting like place kickers.
104.80 meters. This number was echoed throughout the world after Uwe Hohn let go of that javelin in Berlin and let it stick at a point where the final historical barrier had been shattered. Now, does this number have any more significance than it just being over 100 meters? Well, yes. Even though the IAAF had plans to alter the javelin since it kept landing flat so often, which led to judging issues, Hohn's mark was so jarringly alarming that it sped up the process to change the device quite quickly, since there was now a safety issue given he was capable of throwing the javelin nearly outside of a traditional stadium. As far as the javelin changes go, the main change that was implemented was that the center of gravity was shifted 4 centimeters forwards, along with a surface area reduction. Since the spear had drastically changed, this meant that Hohn's record no longer existed and was by all technical means now an unbeatable record. Hohn's career following this was cut extremely short, as in 1985 he put up absurd mark after another, but was never seen again once the changes were implemented in 1986. A true dark night of the event, but now the gates were open for new faces to arrive. Unsurprisingly, after this rule change, the record was falling every 1 to 3 months with brand new throws. Athletes from all around the world were breaking the record at least once initially, but the first one to get the record ratified was Klaus Tafelmayer from West Germany, who threw 85.74. Needless to say, the world record took a huge hit number-wise, as Petronov was no longer breaking 90 meters, and as a matter of fact, no one could break 90 meters at all. Jan Zelezny, Patrick Buldian, and Steve Backley all had the record at one point, but nothing above 90, and certainly a sure shot from touching the legendary 100-meter barrier again. That was, until a new javelin was introduced. Miklos Nemeth, the man who held the world record just a few years before the changes, designed a javelin where there were serrations implemented just behind the grip to let it fly farther. Sure enough, this worked immediately, as Zelezny broke the record just 2 weeks after Backley, but Backley would become the first man to break 90 meters with this device. Seppo Ratti from Finland broke it by another meter in 1991, but in the most unexpected turn of events, he would annihilate the record with this throw. As incredible as this record truly was, the Nemeth javelin Ratti was using unfortunately became outlawed, so this record was incredibly short-lived as a result. Since Backley was the last person to have thrown a non-Nemeth javelin, his records of 89.58 and now 91.46 remained as the marks to shoot for. Jan Zelezny would make his record-breaking return, destroying Backley's mark with a 94.74 meter throw, but there was now a new issue with Zelezny's equipment. After some analysis from Finnish javelin aficionados, they found that the new Nemeth javelin had an extra piece of metal inside, so Zelezny's record was unfortunately not ratifiable. This proved to be just a mere roadblock, as Zelezny made one single throw at a meet in Petersburg where he threw 95.54 on April 6, 1993, and bumped it up 22 more centimeters just a few months later. Zelezny was a specimen of an athlete, as by the end of 1993, he had possessed 9 of the top 15 marks in the all-time list, pretty much cementing himself as the best javelin thrower ever in a very short period of time. 1996 was looking to be the same too, as 90-meter throws were looking like a mere warm-up towards something great, something unique, something that might not ever be beaten again.
Diesen Wurf von Jan Zelezny. Ich sage Ihnen, der alte Weltrekord war bei 95 Meter und 66 und dieser hat sich schon auf über 90 Meter steigern können. Wir sind gleich zurück in Jena mit weiteren weiten Würfen.
98.48 meters. While it's still a fair shot away from the fabled 100-meter echelon, this is without a shadow of a doubt one of the greatest feats of athletic prowess ever put on display. To truly articulate just how absurd this throw was, and still is, Zelezny's previous record of 95.66 scores him a 13.24 on the World Athletic Scoring System, equivalent to a 9.67 in the 100, a 3.40 in the mile, 74 meters in the discus, you get the gist. But 98.48? This is the highest value performance in men's athletics history. Higher than Kipchoge's marathon, higher than Mike Powell's long jump, even higher than Usain Bolt's 100 and 200 meter records. This is a one-of-a-kind mark, and if someone were to throw exactly 100 meters, it would be the all-time greatest achievement between men and women's athletics. Now, conversions are conversions at the end of the day, but even within the context of javelin itself, Zelezny is so far ahead of the curve, it is almost criminal. As the years went by though, another anomaly emerged from Germany, as Germany's Johannes Vetter was throwing almost as consistently far as Zelezny, and eventually had the throw of a lifetime in Poland, where he threw 97.76 on September 6th, 2020. Sadly, Vetter dealt with injuries, and the next farthest, Anderson Peters, has been struggling to break 90 in the last few years. Whether Vetter comes back to full form is uncertain, but at the age of 30, he may only have a few more years of explosive excellence left at his disposal. The javelin has one of the most unique world record histories throughout any event in track and field. It's one of the few events where the equipment itself went through a grand series of changes and is home to some of the highest valued records and athletes of all time. Its rich Finnish and Swedish roots kept the event going strong for decades and decades, and athletes continued to make strides towards it mechanically to the point where someone practically broke the event entirely. What the future holds for this event's record is pretty uncertain. The bar is set so obscenely high that it might not be for another few decades until we see another Zelezny or Vetter, but to count that potential out from happening anytime soon is simply something you can never do in an ever-evolving community, because the next revelation can be just right around the corner that can make history yet again. Until then though, this has been the world record progression of the Javelin, and thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons for supporting the channel, and if you want to support the channel for more track and field content like this, come on over and become a patron, drop a sub, and peep the Instagram too. I'll see you all in whatever video I upload next, and take care.